Could you first introduce yourselves and your roles within the ministries of the Episcopal Church, starting with Reverend Robertson?
Okay, so I'm the Reverend Canon, Dr. Chuck Robertson. I am the canon to the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church with a focus on the ministry beyond our church. So I have the privilege of overseeing our offices for Episcopal Migration Ministries, for our Office of Government Relations in DC, for our ecumenical and interreligious relations, and also for our global partnerships. I am essentially the Secretary of State for the presiding bishop. Demetrio?
And I'm Demetrio Alvero. I'm the Director of Episcopal Migration Ministries, and that deals with both the resettlement program. EMM is one of 9 agencies that work with the federal government on the resettlement of refugees. And also the other half of our work is basically church focused on engaging churches, congregations with outreach, education, explaining the migration issues of the day, be it refugees, asylum seekers, asylees, victims of trafficking, all areas of migration, to better educate the Episcopalians about the issues of the day, if you will.
So you've already said a little bit about your mission statement, but could you go in more depth a little bit about some specific ways in which you, as you state on your website, support, care, and comfort for refugees?
So the ministry that Demetrio was mentioning is actually over 80 years old. Our work in supporting refugees, as he's heard me say a gazillion times, I love the fact that we were helping to make a difference in the lives of refugees coming here in the days of Hitler. So, I mean, we have been at this work as a church for a long time. For the past 40 of those years, we have been an official agency working a partner with the federal government, one of the 9 official agencies, in actually resettling. So for a refugee to come into this country, they can't do it through some private means. A refugee comes in this country through one of the 9 agencies of which we're a part. And so we have resettled how many in?
And we're almost at 100,000.
So for World Refugee Day in 2019, the EMM actually released a video in which you talk about the idea of providing hospitality and care to one who finds himself a stranger in a barren land. How would you say the Episcopal Church's work with refugees ties into its broader mission statement?
Demetrio?
Yeah, well, that is done, as you probably know, if you've been associated with the IRC, you probably know that the refugee program, as funded by the federal government, it does not at all. I mean, it's very basic. It doesn't really do much in terms of funding what is actually required for a refugee. So what we always depend on volunteers and that volunteer spirit. We couldn't get by without the donations that we get from congregations, and ours is a model in which we look at sponsorships, and we basically look to as for example our affiliate in New Haven, which works very closely with the Diocese of Connecticut, and in fact gets money is actually in the budget of the diocese, in which they not only get funding from the diocese, at least in that affiliate, but also an immense number of congregations that form a support network that does housing, looks for housing, provides apartment setups. I mean, we have to provide apartments for refugees, and knowing rents in Connecticut, what the government gives us would pay probably just 1 month's rent. But again, it's the work of volunteers that volunteer to do English as a second language classes, volunteers that donate furniture and set up apartments. It's that model that we've used for the past 40 years. And as Chuck mentioned earlier, for 80 years prior to the government being involved, the churches paid for passage for those fleeing Nazi Europe And they welcomed them in their communities without any government support. So this is just a carryover. Once the government took over the official lead and started funding it, there were requirements, but the church has been doing what it's always been doing for the past 80 years. And we have all sorts of, our engagement unit is involved in particular training on how to advocate for refugees, how to build community support for refugees. When there are council meetings and issues come up about trying to, and we've had this situation in some situations where a certain member in a city council, a local city council wants to pass some legislation restricting refugees. Again, we have, it's the church support, the church who know their neighbors, who come out and speak on behalf of refugees, employers that come out and speak on behalf of refugees. So again, it's building that network of support. When you're a foreigner in a strange land, it's nice to know that you have a community. And the Episcopal Church is a community in where we work, where you know that there's an open door and people who wish to welcome you to their community. And that is in no way, you can't diminish what that support means to someone who's just arrived.
So in regards to building that community, actually, how has general advocacy played a role in the Episcopal Church's work with refugees in terms of informing members of the Episcopal Church and those outside of the Episcopal Church, if those efforts exist?
I think, Chuck, with OGR, I think you can answer
Indeed.
that. Yeah.
So again, I told you at the beginning about kind of the overall structure of the ministry beyond the Episcopal Church that I have the privilege of overseeing. Part of that is our Office of Government Relations in DC. And so we have an office that is solely and wholly dedicated to advocacy with the federal government. We also have an office in New York that is dedicated to UN advocacy efforts and bridge building. And then we also, of course, do things locally. So the beauty is our Episcopal Migration Ministries engagement unit works with the Office of Government Relations, and then they may tie in something, for instance, with the UN, or they may tie in with something locally. But the beauty is by being part of the church's structure, we kind of weave in and out with one another in order to be able to help. So our government relations office alone has long had a position that is solely dedicated to issues of migration, asylum seekers, refugees, immigrants, whatever it is. So we're able to advocate on the federal level. We're able to do work on the local level, working with local dioceses who then can connect with us and work with their governments near them. And we can work on the international level by advocating with the United Nations.
Right. And in real practical terms, you know, when our Office of Government Relations puts out a number of action alerts, and I will say that, you know, when needed in the community, our bishops are strong supporters and they will speak out in communities where needed, whether it be in Texas or in Washington State, when we've had strong support from our bishops and they will speak out.
In fact, one of the things that we work on is we create opportunities for bishops to connect with their members of Congress, and we help, our office actually helps facilitate not just setting it up, but actually facilitate prepping the bishops, giving them the materials they need, giving them the resolutions that we have from our own church governance, and being able to go into that meeting with them, so that from start to finish, we're able to help the bishops talk with their members of Congress, but using our resources.
Yeah. So it's very clear that the Episcopal Church has a strong part in both governmental relations and advocacy, as well as individual help for refugees. But in regards to informing people as the public, what do you think we should be doing to help change the outlook towards refugees, or influencing governmental leaders, or working to change policy?
I'll jump in this in the beginning and then let Demetrio flesh it out a bit. Part of the problem is that for many Americans, I don't think people actually often know what we're even talking about. So part of it is educating people in terms of basic language. What is a refugee? People, sometimes when I'll be talking with members of a congregation or a diocese about the refugee resettlement, then they'll start talking about illegal immigration. And so saying, well, wait a second, do you understand what a refugee is versus someone who seeks asylum versus immigrants of other sorts? And so a lot of this is truly a matter of educating. What we do is working through our church structures is to help certainly educating Episcopalians, as you heard earlier from Demetrio. Beyond that, this is where our ecumenical and interreligious relations comes in as well. We want to partner, and we often partner with other churches and other faith communities to be able to do works of education on this. Because again, a big part of the problem is people not understanding. We have even found that part of our work with Congress is helping in the education factor with members of Congress and their staff. And some have been unafraid to say that they did not understand some of the nuances and distinctions, which are just pretty basic, but they didn't understand them before we came and shared some of that with them.
Right.
Demetrio, you want to go further?
I think you've touched the points exactly that I was going to mention. I mean, we do have certain, we do conduct webinars frequently, and it's meant for, one of the most, I think, interesting aspects is our Love God, Love Neighbor program, or programs where we actually talk to congregations across the Episcopal Church, but it's for them not only to talk to their congregational leaders, but to go back into their communities and serve as that kind of source of information where they can educate their communities. Because again, as Chuck says, it's a matter of understanding the distinctions and what we're talking about. And too often, and again, I'm just reiterating what Chuck has said, there's a confusion. We sort of lump those in an irregular migration situation with asylum seekers and asylees who have been granted asylum and refugees. They're different classes of people, and you've got to understand that.
It is fascinating to me to see how many people don't realize that refugees are among the most vetted people in our country, far more vetted than probably I am. It takes, it's a years long process. A lot of folks don't realize that, and so they lump it all together.
And what's startling is to many people is these are individuals that are picked by our government to come here for government, because the government believes this is a true humanitarian. These refugees are part of our humanitarian response to the crises in the world, and they are picked by our government. They're not people who, I mean, they could be chosen by Canada or Australia or any other country, but the United States has particularly picked these people to come here, and they come here with full documentation and can start work the minute they arrive once they get their papers.
And this is why the process of educating folks is every bit as important as the advocacy.
Yeah.
Thank you. So not everything is ideal and easy. So I was wondering, how much pushback have you faced with your efforts, and what, if any, obstacles have you encountered?
Demetrio, you first.
Well, you usually get the odd person who, to be honest, we really get a lot of support. You may recall when the executive order came out limiting refugees, giving states and localities the option to opt out of the program. We thought, oh, we'll see a number of states opting out. We thought that all, to not to be over politicize it, but we thought, oh, all the red states are going to opt out. Guess what? Only one governor, and that was Governor Abbott, took the lead in opting out, but all his mayors opted in. So you had the mayor of Houston, the mayor of Dallas, all saying, we want this program, with the governor, and even the governor's chief of staff was encouraging the governor to opt in, but the governor, for whatever reasons, and I don't want to say they were all political, but for whatever reasons, he decided to opt out. But we were surprised. Tennessee, the governor opted in. Georgia, governor opted. All, we received tremendous support. So to me, that's an indication that, and the last Pew research that I saw on immigration in general, 61% of Americans were in favor of immigration to this country. There was no opposition. So again, I think there's more of a divide among those that are more polarized, that want to use this issue as a kind of wedge issue. But at least from the polls that I've seen and what happened with the executive order, there's an underlying, and this is a nation of immigrants. I mean, I recall one of our Lutheran colleagues, you remember Stephen Bauer, Chuck?
Absolutely.
He once had a great line. How far do you have to go back before you realize that one of your relatives was an immigrant? And he says, for most of us, it's our grandparents. Mm-hmm. You don't have to go too far back. There are very few that go into 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. But most of us came in the late 1800s. Mm-hmm. So we are a nation of immigrants. So to say that there's a great deal of push, now again, it's very politicized, but again, the only way you can get through it is education. And you've got employers that want refugees because they fill in an important niche for entry-level jobs. They start up businesses in their communities. We know of the economic, there have been studies after studies about the net gain for the economy for when you do have immigration. And so, it's just a matter of education.
It's well known that we as a church cannot be, nor should be, ever partisan.
No.
But we are political in the best sense, in my opinion, in the sense of entering into the lives of human interaction, right, and doing what's right, whichever. And so EMM and our work as a church with EMM, we have been working, it doesn't matter who's in office or what party's in office. Yep. And in fact, I just want to give a great shout out to the career civil servants in the various parts of government who are there, whatever, they too are nonpartisan. They are there for the long haul, and working with them has often been a great privilege in terms of them understanding this cannot become partisan. This is human. This is what we are called to do for our fellow children of God.
And one aspect that we should raise here is that the church has been involved in having civil discourse. It's to get this this politicization out of our language and to have really talk to one another civilly. We can have an honest discussion about immigration. And we're not denying that, but to have a civil discussion.
So our Office of Government Relations has actually created and propagated throughout the church, for those who wish to use it, a curriculum on civil discourse, which many of our dioceses and congregations have chosen to use.
Mm-hmm. Going off of my previous question then, how has the COVID-19 pandemic in particular affected the process of seeking refuge around the globe or within the country? And how has it affected your efforts to assist refugees, if in any way?
Demetrio?
Well, the program was suspended for 4 months because of the COVID-19. And it's still affecting, although the suspension has been lifted, flights are still a problem. When flights can't get to and from Europe, people can't travel, and that includes refugees. So it has limited the number who can come in. It's also limited interviews because COVID is widespread overseas. The interviews that go on by the immigration service can't go forward. So you're not interviewing potential refugees to adjudicate their cases. That slows down the number of who will come to the country. So yes, it has had an effect. but it's affected all aspects of life. I mean, it's not just immigration, it's all aspects of life. And that you would expect.
And to be honest, the fact is that we saw massive decreases before COVID.
Right.
So without getting certainly without getting overly politicized, we
Right.
already were dealing with issues of limits that were record limits that we had never seen before in the 40 years of resettlement.
Right.
So more personally about both of you, how did you two get interested in the field? What drew you in, and what path did you take to get where you are today?
Demetrio, you first.
My parents are Cuban. They came to this country, as most of my relatives came after the Castro takeover and the nationalization of most industries. And I always tell the story of my uncle who was specialized in pulmonology, study of the lungs, and he had a clinic in Havana that was taken over by the government, and he was given a salary of $2 a month.
Wow.
And so he and a lot of professionals of that era decided no, and he couldn't practice what he wanted to practice. So he came to the United States, and like the land of opportunity, he studied, and he became the chief of staff of Fort Lauderdale General Hospital in Miami, in Florida.
Demetrio, the fact is though that you could have done any number of things with your career, your vocation.
Yeah.
But
I early on, I actually assisted as a volunteer with many of those Cubans that came in Florida in the early 60s. I was in my teens with my grandmother assisting people in Miami. And I later joined the International Organization for Migration, and I worked for 20 years overseas working with refugee and migration issues before coming here and working with the Episcopal Migration Ministries.
So I can't top Demetrio's story, but I will say for me, I've a priest of almost 30 years and have served parishes. I've served dioceses. I worked for the Archbishop of Canterbury at one time, taught at seminaries, but for the past 13 years have been in this position. And for me, my whole idea of ministry is about connection. And so everything for me is about, the word networking that people love to use. Long before that word existed in the lexicon, that is what I love, is I see God that God's work is about connecting people to God, connecting people to each other, connecting us to our own selves, because we get disconnected internally sometimes. So for me, making connections, figuring out, okay, we have an issue in San Diego going on with the border. How do we work on that? And how do we tie that into our federal advocacy? Oh, and then how do we bring in dioceses from the Anglican Church of Mexico? So we work with that. So to me, part of the beauty of the work is figuring out how to make connections where previously they didn't exist. And that I find very exciting indeed.
Thank you. So just to wrap it up, as we're coming close to the time limit, could you discuss some ways for young people around the world to help, especially during these times?
Thank you. Good question.
Thank you.
Demetrio?
Well, it starts with we've had youth groups come when we were pre-pandemic. We would have a lot of students that were that were seminarians who were studying, who were in their early 20s, to come in and understand what refugees are. Again, it's education, and then become involved. We have a lot of we always ask for volunteers. And youth can always help with setting up apartments. They can always assist if they're capable to drive refugees to appointments, to get them to know the transit system. There's a lot of cultural orientation that must go on, and people don't know their communities. I mean, when you're a Burmese and you land in Los Angeles, you can go to the Burmese community and probably get some assistance there, but also to know that there's a culture outside of your small little community, and they can certainly introduce them to how to use the transit system, and a number of things. Teach them English as a second language. So become involved. You can become involved. There are 100 affiliates that work among the 9 national agencies. There are about 100 or so that work throughout the country with refugees. Get them to one of the affiliates. IRC is one. If you know youth, you know how youth can intersect with the local affiliate. And for us, particularly, it's Episcopal youth and how they can become involved.
So I would simply add to what Demetrio said, that it really is about both getting educated as to what's going on the local level, and also learning what can be done on an advocacy level. Both are crucial. Faith groups can help with this. So faith groups, churches, mosques, synagogues can help. Certainly for our own part, we have a thing called the Episcopal Public Policy Network, to which people can join, youth and otherwise, and just join to get updates on what's going on in our federal advocacy work. And we're certainly not the only ones who do that. So whatever one's tradition, to tap into that and say, okay, well, what is going on the local level? And also, how can you help me understand how my voice can be heard in the halls of Congress? I think those are both important.
Yeah, and just to highlight what Chuck said, for Episcopalians, especially Episcopal youth, it's one way they can live into their faith and welcoming the stranger.
Absolutely.
Thank you.